Earlier this morning, I had the pleasure of dialoguing with Michael Hogue, the author of American Immanence, Democracy for an Uncertain World. Um, Professor Hogue teaches at Medville Lombard Theological School in Chicago. He's a professor of theology. In addition to this text, he's the author of The Tangled Bank Toward an Eco-Theological Ethics of Responsible Participation, published in 2008, as well as another book, The Promise of Religious Naturalism, published in 2010. We spoke for about an hour about the arguments that he makes in this book, trying to both contest the dominant paradigm in American political theory and political theology, as well as to offer some constructive suggestions drawing upon the tradition of American philosophy and pragmatism coming out of William James and John Dewey and Alfred North Whitehead. You'll see that we, at the end, got into an interesting conversation about Whitehead's theology and the ways that it needs to be reformed. I'll probably end up posting a video of my own reflecting on that. Michael and I realized that we needed another hour to just get into the intricacies of Whitehead's concept of God, and so that is for the future. I hope you enjoy our conversation and consider reading his wonderful and important and timely book. Mike, thanks so much for joining me to talk about your new books. It was published in 2018, but we all have great books stacked high that we're hoping to read, and so maybe this is still on people's list of books that they must read soon, even though it was published 2 years ago. American Immanence, Democracy for an Uncertain World. And there are so many important ideas that are relevant and applicable to our current, not just political life, but our cosmic existence and our ecological existence as human beings in the Anthropocene, which is one of the important conditions for philosophizing and doing political theory that you thematize in this text. And you're dealing with an American philosophical tradition, William James, John Dewey, Alfred North Whitehead, and others. That's a stream of thought that's very important to me. And I was really excited and I'm enthusiastic about the ways that you're bringing these thinkers into the contemporary situation, showing how their ideas are as relevant now as they ever were before. And that there's this sort of dissident stream or a stream of resistance to the dominant mode of theological and political thinking and acting in America, that this immanental tradition, as you call it, has been articulating for more than a century now. And so in dialogue with you, I'd like to sort of draw out this, unfortunately, somewhat marginalized stream of thought in the American tradition and try to, maybe we can, and I think this is the work that your book is trying to do, bring this stream more into the mainstream. As I mentioned, it seems to me that you finished writing this book just as the presidential election in 2016 was being decided and that Donald Trump was going to be our new president. And I wanted to start there because you described Trump as a vivid sign and a symptom that America is entering another great trial of its democracy. And you begin with the great late American sociologist Robert Bellah, who discussed the three great trials that preceded our moment in American history: the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, and the Civil Rights Movement. And in the 21st century, we're faced with a new crisis. Trump is a symptom, you say. And I wonder, in the last 2 years, how has your view of this developed, this great trial that we're entering into now? Has it changed at all? Or do you feel like with the pandemic, obviously, and the worsening political divide, that much of the framing that you put into this book still holds true?
First of all, thanks, Matt, for inviting me onto your show and for reading the book. I think in response to your question, so, yes, I was literally finishing the book, and I think going back to the introduction or the early chapter, just as the 2016 election was unfolding. And so I had to rethink some things. I think like a lot of folks, I was under the impression, based on polls and other things and based on polls and what turned out to be problematic assumptions, I think that Hillary Clinton was going to win the election. And so when it turned out that Trump won the election, I had to rethink or bring that into the story that I was trying to tell, especially in the first chapter or so of the book, in which I outline, this idea of the fourth trial of American democracy. So since finishing the book, and as a result of living through these last several years under the Trump regime, I would say that the way I've begun to talk and think about what's going on with Trump is to say not only that Trump is a symptom of many of the flaws in our American political system, our American political cultures, and with respect to the mythology of American exceptionalism. So not only a symptom of those flaws, but an accelerant of them as well. So it's like it's easy to pin all the problems onto Trump or onto any of the other kind of populist authoritarians that are coming to power around the world, whether it's Duterte in the Philippines, Orban in Hungary, Erdogan in Turkey, Bolsonaro in Brazil, right? These are figures that kind of bring so much attention to them, and they're so problematic in so many ways that I think it's easy to think that the problem is with these figures, right? And so what I wanted to say is that the problem is not simply with the figures. Like by getting rid of them, we're going to get rid of the problem. The idea that if Trump is not reelected, then we go back to that was just an anomaly, and we go back to democracy as usual in the United States. I don't think that that's going to happen. And so for that reason, I think it's important to understand that there are other issues, other conditions, other causes and dynamics that give rise to the appeal of figures like Trump and the other populist authoritarians. So we're living in a world of this swirling and mutually amplifying complex global problems, whether it's climate emergency or pandemic or rising inequality or polarization through social media, the monetizing of cognitive biases for profit, all of these things are really complicated problems. And in the world of complex problems, simplistic solutions have a lot of appeal. And populist authoritarians like Trump and others find ways to offer simplistic solutions, and that's part of their popularity. The simplistic solutions often have to do with demonizing other people, dehumanizing others, putting all of the blame on, dividing the world. And here we're seeing that in the United States in a pretty extreme and radical way. So to me, it's important to say that Trump is a symptom rather than a cause of the problems. And since he's been in power, an accelerant of the various challenges and problems that we're living in and through. So I guess as an initial response to the question, so I would say, I think that these last 4 years have just confirmed the original, or the idea that I had and the way I was writing and what I was writing about in the early part of the book. And now I see him also as an accelerant of the issues.
Yeah, I think this is opening the book and opening our conversation by pointing out that Trump is not the cause, but the symptom, and that there are manifestations of the rise of a form of nationalist populism all around the world. And that I love how you put this, that it's a response to a complex situation in a desperate search for simplicity and certainty. I mean, the subtitle of your book, Democracy for an Uncertain World, there's a deeper ontological or metaphysical meaning to uncertainty that I hope we'll get into later. But in other words, the world itself is is an open-ended process of becoming, right? So uncertain in that, our knowledge will always be uncertain in that context. And so there's nothing unique about our complicated situation that makes it such that we need a more sort of non-foundationalist understanding of how we come to know things about the world. But in a more political and social register, because of social media and some of the dynamics of the monetization of our attention and desire and the way that we can be so easily manipulated by these screens, there's a rising uncertainty about where power lies in our society, who's really in charge. There's so many conspiracy theories proliferating, and everyone has a different understanding of who's really in charge. And it makes it difficult for us to have a political conversation where there are public norms of discourse and agreed upon facts and all these things that are necessary for self-governance. And so there's uncertainty in that sense too, just at the human level.
Yeah. So, I guess another way to think about all of this is through the lens of apocalypse and apocalyptic, right? It's simultaneously a sense of everything breaking down and falling apart, and in a sense coming to an end, but also illuminating things that have always been the case, right? Like you've said, I think that from a process-oriented kind of metaphysics or cosmology, the world is always in motion and in process and unfinished, and therefore uncertain. And yet it's been easy for us to be, to live under the illusion of certainty, of kind of, inevitable progress with respect to rights and freedoms or liberation or whatever. And what's being revealed is how precarious all of that is and has always been. And so on the one hand, you can say, the rising ethno-nationalism is kind of here in the US and elsewhere is both capitalizing on breakdown and complexity, but also illuminating it in ways that are possibly productive. Right? So I think you see more people getting more civically engaged, more politically active, more urgent about their politics, and in terms of being contributing in positive ways to liberation and democracy. And that's happened because of, right, partly because of the clear threat that Trump and other ethno-nationalists present to democracy. So symptom accelerant, and also a kind of a lens that helps us to see things that have always been the case, that we've been deluded into thinking were not the case. Democracy is an experiment, that it's precarious, that it's unfinished, it never will be finished. And the idea that it's been realized or achieved is a really dangerous idea, right? And so it needs to be constantly improved and requiring lots of courage and innovation and commitment, unceasing commitment, engagement, and courage. Mm. So to the extent that that's happening, I think that that's a positive thing.
Right. Yeah, it seems, to find the silver lining in our situation, it seems that people are more aware now of the ways in which the crises, plural, that we are facing they go so much further beyond the typical two-party political system, the way that system frames problems and solutions. There's a deeper crisis in the very mode of production, in the very nature of the political economy of capitalism, and in the relationship of human beings to the non-human community of life on this planet. And so it could be maybe that Trump, as an accelerant to this process, is forcing us beyond those the framework of normalcy, even if the Democratic Party takes control and Biden wins the presidency and they take control of Congress, we're still going to be faced with wicked problems.
Yeah.
And the solutions to those problems are not just a matter of new legislation, though, legislation can help, but there's a deeper existential transformation in our very understanding of who we are and what the universe is that your book is calling us to. And so to shift gears a little bit, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the breakdown of secular liberalism, right? You're writing this text in the context of a post-secular and a post-liberal age. Maybe you can speak to why there is this crisis in secular liberalism and why that crisis has made room for something like political theology or theopolitics, as you call it, to become relevant again.
Okay, so let me just add a different context for that question, if I could. So the book is really engage. It's organized around critical, conceptual, and constructive theses, and the critical theses have to do with mutually amplifying political and planetary dysfunction, right? And the political is what we've just been talking about briefly. The planetary challenge is something I explore under the idea of the Anthropocene paradox. And the Anthropocene, as most of your listeners and viewers probably are familiar with, is the idea that we've entered a human age for the Earth. And I talk about that as a paradox because at the same time that the Anthropocene provides us, is naming the fact that we have made the Earth homo imago in our human image, it's in doing that, we've discovered that we are terra bestia, Earth creatures, or rediscovered. Not that everybody, in other words, let's say the Western, globally northern, world shaped by the modern Western Enlightenment is discovering that we are terra bestiae, human creatures, Earth creatures. And that discovery, or that paradox, is important with respect to your question about liberalism and secularism for a couple of reasons. One, because the paradox also breaks down two of the assumptions of Enlightenment modernity. One, that humans are separate from nature, and two, that certainty, that objective certainty about the nature of things and truth is possible. So the Anthropocene paradox for me represents both the idea of a time after human separatism or the apartheid between humans and nature, and also a time after certainty. And so it creates this new context for, and a new set of kind of imperatives and urgencies for rethinking, what it means to be a human being as an Earth creature, what has value and worth, how we think about the future, how we understand what it means to exercise human power and responsibility. So all of those things, I think, are up in the air as a result of this transition into the Anthropocene. And so, among the things that need to be rethought, I think, are liberalism as a political tradition and context, and secularism as an aspect of the liberal tradition. And specifically, I think, with respect to liberalism, there's a core idea within it about the human person as an autonomous, self-legislating, individual, separate from others, right? And the idea, or the normative person in the liberal tradition was a person whose relationships and whose various identities were abstracted from this the idea of the individual. And that's a deeply problematic assumption, right? Because at least in the traditions that have shaped me, it's impossible to think about anything apart from our relationships, and those relationships and the contexts that we're in, and the various aspects of our embodied identities, our racial, gender, sexual, affectional, orientations, and all of that are constitutive of who we are and cannot or should not be abstracted from us. So I guess the basic idea is that the Anthropocene paradox creates or opens a space for the rethinking and the reimagining of a political anthropology, a concept of the human person as a political creature. It recreates or creates new urgency for understanding our human responsibilities towards the more than human world. And so one of the background ideas that's influenced me is this idea of panarchy, that there's thinking about how the world is shaped. The world is a nest of systems, and any system in a state of breakdown, and here we're talking about planetary and political breakdown, is also a system with new potential in it, right? And so the idea is, how can we leverage at the same time that the breakdown is producing anxiety and fear and a sense of threat and precarity for all of us, what new potential is available for us to reimagine the world, to restory the world, to develop an alternative politics, alternative ways of being religious. So that's really kind of the opening that I'm exploring in the book, is how the Anthropocene paradox creates this new potential and what then we can do with it constructively with respect to theology and politics. And that's really what the constructive part of the book is about.
Maybe can you speak a bit about the ways that, strangely enough, in the context of the history of the United States of America, somehow evangelical Christianity became wedded to this liberal conception of the individual and the role of the market in sort of replacing society as the locus of order and progress for the human being. William Connolly, who I know has influenced your work, the political theorist and philosopher, he talks about the what does he say, the evangelical capitalist resonance machine. Right. So how did these seemingly opposed ideas, like evangelical Christians are always berating liberals and liberalism, and yet there's a way in which this abstracted conception of the individual, whose only relations to other individuals come through the marketplace, that has become the political economy, that evangelical Christians are willing to even vote someone as immoral and distant from the Bible and God as Donald Trump to be their representative. How did this connection happen?
So it's a great question. There's a lot of literature and scholarship out there on this. And William Connolly, like you mentioned, I think is very, very good on this, and he's influenced me quite a bit. The way I track this in my book is through something I call the Redeemer Symbolic. And I'll explain that in a second. But essentially, I think what has happened is that this Redeemer Symbolic has migrated through U.S. history through several different phases. And we're currently living within a phase that some people talk about as the neoliberal phase, in which a kind of market cosmology has become a surrogate religious cosmology. And so that's where I think that we're at. And let me explain now how I understand and define the Redeemer Symbolic and how we got to this point. I'll try to be as succinct as I can. So the Redeemer Symbolic, as I define it, is organized around a moral logic that we see repeated through American history. And the logic is basically as follows. There is a one who or that has been symbolically invested with saving power, right? So these are not just religious or biblical narratives. Of course, I think the Christ narrative is the paradigm of in the Christian West of the Redeemer Symbolic, but it doesn't have to be connected to the Christian figure of the Christ. But there is a one who has been invested with saving power. That one is an exception and enacts an exception. The one is an exception to the extent that it is different from all other versions of its kind, right? It's not constrained in the same way. It's somehow ontologically singular, right? It's different from all others of its kind. So it's an exception in that sense. It stands apart from and outside of other things that are like it. It enacts an exception by extracting value from something and externalizing cost. Okay, so this is the logic. There is a one that is invested symbolically with saving power. This one is an exception and enacts an exception. So that's the logical core of this idea of the Redeemer Symbolic. And through American history, I think that we see the one who is invested symbolically with the saving power transition, from an earlier kind of ecclesial phase, the idea of the earlier settler colonial idea of this being a city, shining city on a hill. So it was that as a religious community, this new experiment would be a saving influence in the larger world of Christendom. Okay, so the earlier settler colonial and early national history is representative of this ecclesial phase of the Redeemer Symbolic. And then we see a nationalist or a frontier phase where all of a sudden the saving one becomes symbolized by the nation, really an ethnos, an ethno-nation, right? The white supremacist nation. This becomes the exception. So it's the nation that becomes exceptional, the idea of the nation, especially as constituted by a white ethnos. All right, and then over time, the saving one migrates again first from an ecclesial idea to a nationalist idea, and now to the idea of the free market. And so it's the free market that is the saving or redemptive figure. And so essentially what we're talking about is how a religious cosmology has migrated through history to provide different contexts for thinking about what is saving, who is saved, what should be saved, who's outside of salvation, right? And in each of these phases, there's a different context for understanding all of those questions. And I think that the context we're in right now is one, a neoliberal context in which it's the idea of a free, unencumbered market and of capitalism as the saving figure. And so it's a religious cosmology that's migrated into the marketplace that then I think white evangelical Christians in particular are fused with and oriented by. And so anything that is a challenge to that, like the redistribution of wealth, like reparations for past, theft of land and genocide and all of that, anything that is in some ways a challenge to the myth of the market as a redeeming force in the world is not only rejected or challenged on policy grounds, but rejected and challenged on religious grounds. And so it's an affront to one's religious identity, right? Anything that stands in the way of or isn't somehow antithetical to or offers a counter vision to the religious cosmology of the marketplace.
Hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. I think back to, I'm too young to have voted, obviously, in the early 90s when George Bush the first and Bill Clinton and Ross Perot were debating. And there was this moment when Perot talks about the need to defend and protect capitalism. And back then, politicians in the two major parties didn't really mention capitalism as the thing that needed to be protected. But now we're at a point where, with the sort of insurgent candidacy of Bernie Sanders and the rise of the Democratic Socialists of America, there's a real capitalism's on the defensive, and there's a defense of capitalism by both evangelical Christians, but also more atheistic libertarian types, that takes a religious form. There's an almost unveiling of the religious dimension of the myth of the market, or the capitalist cosmology, as you were referring to it. And so it's a new context now that I think is both more dangerous, but also there's potential there.
Yeah, so insofar as, in our two-party system, Republicans have succeeded in caricaturing the left, and Democrats specifically, as socialists, then you have a zero-sum politics, because you have, if anything that's challenging to or questioning the ideal, and it's a mythic ideal because it's not actually the case that the market is free. Anything that challenges the myth of the free market is treated as a kind of apostasy, right? Or kind of lack of faith. And so the political conflict, our polarized political conflict, takes the shape of and has the feel of a kind of holy war, right, between competing religious communities. But that has happened, I think, or that's, one way to interpret how and why that's happened is through the migration of this Redeemer Symbolic, from an ecclesial to a nationalist and into an economic and a neoliberal phase. But yeah, it's so, we talk about living in different informational universes or informational ecologies or media ecologies. I think it's actually that we could also say that we're living in different religious cosmologies, right? That the political conflicts in our time, which are always intersecting with racial and religious and other types of cultural dimensions and conflicts, have the character of religious conflict, right? And that's why it seems like so much is at stake, why there's so much anxiety, why there's so much suspicion. And I think, it's just a kind of kindling of, fear and loathing of one another.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in your chapter on the Redeemer Symbolic, I also appreciate the way you point out how this politics of the exception and exceptionalism and American exceptionalism creates a situation where the dominant mythos of this nation it's as if by analogy to the biblical view of providential history, that this country has a unique God-given mission, and that when Europeans arrived, or I think we need to say invaded this continent, as if this land was just virgin, as if it was just a new world, and that God's original intention for humanity could be enacted after Europe and the mess of the old world sort of failed to live up to that. Oh, well, America can now live up to this God-given mission, and that the theology of exception and the view of providential history that goes into the myth of the founding of this nation functions to erase the fact that it was an invasion. It erases the genocide, the ecocide, the slavery that allowed this country, originally run by white men, to become economically dominant in the world. That it wasn't as if this country was created ex nihilo from nothing. It was created through the theft of land, genocide, slavery, and so on, and ecocide. And so it challenging this Redeemer Symbolic, I think, allows us to tell our history again and maybe begin to try to acknowledge and I think there's a role for atonement here, perhaps, which doesn't erase the wrong that has been done. It forces us to confront it, to try to restore a sense of dignity to the descendants of the peoples who have been wronged, and to try to reimagine a society that lifts up the oppressed and that doesn't just continue to reserve power for whoever the exceptional few are. So do you see, there's a deep religious significance to this notion of atonement in the biblical tradition, and do you think that there's a way in which the process of restorative justice that is necessary for this country to move forward, can you connect it in any way to this notion of atonement, or would you look to other theological resources in order to understand how we can heal from this history?
That's a great question. And what I'll say is, it's interesting that you're asking the question in the context of this idea of the ex nihilo discovery of the Americas, right? Which is, right, it's a biblical trope or theological trope. And we know that, that the historical justification for the conquest and colonizing of the Americas was a theological document, which we, a set of papal bulls that we now know and think of as the doctrine of discovery, right? And essentially, the idea was that the first European nation to discover an unoccupied territory had a right to the title of that territory, a right of title to that territory. And of course, what was meant by unoccupied was unoccupied by those who were not Christians, right? And in fact, not only those who were not Christians, but those who were probably subhuman were treated as and thought about as subhuman. And so the discovery doctrine essentially gave this idea that the discovery of the Americas was kind of that there was nothing here before that, right? So it was an ex nihilo, creation from nothing. The Americas came from out of nothing. There was no one here, and it was terra nullius. It was a nothing place, right? Before it was discovered by Europeans. So I think that that's an important history for all of us to know, and it's a part of, I think, atonement is to become aware of the complexity of the story of the Americas and the genocide of the indigenous peoples and the enslavement of Black bodies as the basis for, as you rightly put it, the emergence of the United States as an international superpower, right? You don't have economic prosperity if you don't have stolen land, if you don't have free labor. That just doesn't happen in the same way. So part of atonement, I think, is at least becoming aware of that history. And then, in addition to that, I think that the consciousness of that history, and it's interesting, recently Trump has been talking about a kind of patriotic curriculum, right? Or, as anti-American, any type of curricular work in schools or elsewhere that wants to tell this fuller story about the United States and the Americas. That's anti-American. Why? Because it acknowledges that we're not an ex nihilo nation, right? That we're founded in genocide. We're founded in enslavement, right? And so to tell that story is antithetical to the dominant story of American history. So atonement means coming to terms with and at least becoming aware of the fuller history, the complexity of history, the tragedy of all of this. And then in addition to that, I think atonement is insufficient if there are not reparations. So for me, you asked, is the idea of atonement something that I've been thinking and working with? And actually what I've been thinking and working more with recently, personally, at least as much as in my professional life, is reparations. What sort of reparative work? How does one pay back a debt, right? Not charitably offer a gift, but to pay back a debt, right? What does that mean for me personally? And that's been the work that I and my family and I have been working together on in community with others. What does that mean? What does that look like for us? And there's a real material basis to it, right? There's a financial dimension to it. And to me, that's where my mind and heart are at a lot of the time right now, is what do reparations call me? What does a reparations mindset and a reparations commitment call me? How does it call me to change my life, right? What practical material difference does it make? And that's what we're trying to figure out as a family, and in my faith community as well. So I think that atonement is a part of that, and part of atonement means knowing the fuller complexity of the story. But if that's all that there is, if all it is a conscious awareness of this fuller story, that's insufficient. In addition to that conscious awareness, also reparations, I think, on a national scale, and certainly on a personal level, is, I think, the responsible thing to do.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think there's a battle right now for our conceptions of justice in this country, with one being retributive justice, revenge, versus restorative justice, or an attempt to repair what has been wronged, not just to punish the wrongdoer. And the conversation around reparations is so essential for anything like a functional democracy to really grow out of the ashes of the history of denial and the socially unjust and ecologically suicidal sort of corporatocracy that we're in right now. And so I hope that conversation can take place. We only have a few minutes left, but I really want to talk about the some of the metaphysical work that you do around how we understand the God symbol and the social function of religion, as it is articulated by thinkers like especially Dewey and Whitehead and William James. So I think in the background here is this shift from the metaphysics that's implied by a feudalistic social order to a metaphysics of democracy. And there are so many ways in which, despite several hundred years and the history of the modern world, and this shift toward a more democratic values, we have a lot of work left to do in that regard, just to realize democracy at the social and political level. But there's also work to do metaphysically in reimagining how we conceive of the source of order in the world, and the purpose of the universe, how value and power can be reimagined in a democratic ontology versus a more hierarchical and static feudalistic conception of the world order. And so in this context, you draw obviously on Whitehead's process relational view, where he says famously in Process and Reality, we find ourselves in a buzzing world amidst a democracy of fellow creatures, that's our primal condition, and that all of our thinking and feeling and valuing arises out of that relational context. And you say that Whitehead's process relational ontology can function as a blueprint for deep social change. So can you speak to the ways in which, like, how can Whitehead's philosophy function as a blueprint in that way?
I think that there are three dimensions of a Whiteheadian and a process relational metaphysics more broadly that are important for rethinking democracy, and that have theopolitical implications. And the first is the contrast between an event and a substance ontology, right? And so in the process, as you, and I'm sure many of your viewers are aware, in a process cosmology, the fundamental units of reality are events rather than individual isolated substances. So there's a temporality of the world is in motion, in other words. And so there's an event structure to reality. So that's one thing. And I'll connect this back to what the implications are for democracy in a second. But the event ontology, and then the concept of internal relatedness, that we're internally related to one another, not just externally related to one another. So we're not just, atomistic individuals bumping up against each other in a Newtonian social world, but we are events, temporal events. In fact, each of us as an individual is a society of temporal events that are internally related to other. We're constitutive of one another. Now, for Whitehead, not every actual occasion is related to all other actual occasions, but every actual occasion is related at least to some others. So the internal relatedness ties us together into kind of a network of mutuality, to a network of reciprocal and mutually constitutive relationships that are the conditions of our lives. Okay, so an event versus a substance ontology, internal relatedness versus external relatedness, and then wrapped up in that, I think, is the idea that instead of thinking of difference, I think that sets us up to think about differences less in terms of oppositions, things that are opposed to one another, existing in some kind of hierarchy of value. But instead of thinking of oppositions, it sets us up to think about contrast, mutually enriching contrast. How difference, whether we're thinking in the social realm of like gender, sexual, racial, and cultural difference, as potentially enriching and mutually enriching contrast rather than oppositions that set us apart and against from one another. So all three of those dimensions of the process cosmology or metaphysics, I think, are important for democracy. That democracy is not a thing, it's not an entity, it's not a substance, it's not reducible to the institutions of democracy or to any set of fixed forms, but is something that's in motion and in process, right? It's eventual, it's something that has to be continuously struggled for. The idea that it's ever finalized or finished or complete or achieved is a counter-democratic idea. So the event ontology provides us with a different set of, helps us to think about democracy, it challenges the idea that democracy is a set of fixed forms. Mm-hmm. Instead, it's in motion, it's in process, it requires continuous struggle. The idea of internal relatedness, in contrast to simply being externally related to one another, helps us to see that we're mutually responsible for one another. So it enlivens a sense of a common good or a good beyond self-interest, right? If we're internally related to one another, that your well-being is tied up with mine and vice versa, and each of us is networked with so many others, then I think that helps us to work against the reduction of moral value, moral good, and political responsibility to self-interest. So internal relatedness enlivens a sense of common good and collective responsibility. And then the importance of contrast rather than opposition is that it breaks down it helps to break down what Carl Schmitt talked about as the friend-enemy distinction in politics, right? Instead of differences leading us to exist, instead of relating to differences in a hostile and an antagonistic and a threatened way, right, we can see difference as potentially enriching, contrasts that can potentially enrich our own experience. And this is part of how Whitehead talks about beauty as mutually enriching and refining contrasts of experience. And so all of that, to me, can be integrated into a fuller and a more realistic, a more empathic, emancipatory, and equitable practice of democracy. Not concept of democracy, but practice of democracy. And and embedding that in the Whiteheadian cosmology, you could say it's that type of democracy that is a part of the building of a more beautiful world, that is part of helping part of the eros of the universe. The telos of the universe is towards this ideal of beauty as mutually enriching contrast of experience. And so the practice of democracy then both has all of this metaphysical background and context to it, but can also be situated in relation to a cosmovision, right, of the universe moving towards beauty. So I think it's a tradition that has this immanental tradition, and specifically this process dimension to it, has a lot of political and theopolitical potential to it it's not been entirely neglected, but I think is underdeveloped. And that we're living in a time right now where I think it's more and more relevant and important. And part of the case I make for the recovery or the revitalization of this immanental tradition is that just as the Anthropocene paradox is helping us to live beyond the illusion of human separatism from nature and to live beyond the illusion of the ideal of certainty, the immanental tradition in American philosophical and religious thought was also generated by those same insights, right? That humans are not apart from nature, they exist within nature. That humans can only know nature from the inside of it rather than the outside of it. And that means that all human knowing is provisional, fallible, and hypothetic. And so they were doing philosophy, in a sense, in the midst of an Anthropocene paradox that hadn't yet been named that. And that's why I think it's an important tradition for us to be looking at right now.
Wonderful. Yeah, I think one of the ways that a process relational view provides the ontology and the groundwork for democracy in the political realm, I think, is by showing how individuals are always constituted by their relations, as you were saying. It still allows us to value individual experience. I mean, in Whitehead's cosmos, actual occasions of experience are individuals, and that individual experience for Whitehead is a really important locus of value. But individuals are always relationally constituted. They exist in the context of societies bound together by symbols and by habits. But it's the individual for Whitehead that is the source of novelty. And there's a need to negotiate the way that novelty and creative experience gets integrated back into the communal or social life. And that's the work of democracy. And, the internal and external relations is really important. I think there are tendencies among maybe the idealist tradition in philosophy toward a sense that, the idealists are really good on oneness, like we're all one. But the problem with that view of oneness is that it can sometimes function in a totalitarian way to erase individual difference, as if the individual just gets negated or sublated into the whole. And some renditions of what idealism, how it cashes out politically, look a lot like fascism. And so, the American immanental tradition is an alternative that doesn't deny oneness, but it seems to articulate oneness as a mode of interconnectivity. But as you were saying, every individual is connected to all other individuals, but not in the same way or to the same degree, right? James will talk about, I think it's in A Pluralistic Universe, one of his last lecture series, he talks about interconnectivity, that everything is connected in a strung along way. It's kind of this networked way, rather than in this totalizing, homogenizing way that erases difference. And so I think there are some unique resources here to think through some of the paradoxes and tensions in democratic life that wants to foster the freedom of individuals and the freedom of communities in the context of an open-ended universe and process where there aren't any fixed moral principles that hold true for all time, for all peoples in all situations, right? So I really appreciate the way that you thematize this in your book. Do you want to respond to that at all?
I'll just say that I think that Whitehead has a very famous phrase that kind of captures that, you know, the way this process that capture or represents the way the process cosmology honors multiplicity and unity at the same time, right? That the many become one and are increased by one. Mm-hmm. So it's not that the internal relatedness or the event ontology diminishes or somehow flattens individuality out, but it's individuality in a different setting, in a different mode. So the many become one and are increased by one, I think is that phrase that just crystallizes precisely what you're talking about.
Yeah. There's one line I wanted to share with folks from your book where you say that democracy is the pre-political precedent of every other political possibility. I think that that's so important in this moment when, when liberalism is under attack, that can sometimes be conflated with the idea that, oh, democracy won't work. And there's lots of reasons in the context of the United States of America to be skeptical of democracy because we're failing at this political experiment. And many Americans on both sides or all sides of the political spectrum feel like other people are stupid and don't deserve to have a political voice or political power. And so there's a lot of skepticism of democracy, and I think it's important to revitalize the deeper metaphysical significance of it, and how engaging in democratic self-governance is actually coming into alignment with the deep structure of the universe itself. And it breaks down that bifurcation of nature between nature and culture, or earth and humans, or the universe and humans that Whitehead was protesting against. So I think, the work that you're doing in this regard is so important so that we don't lose hope in the possibility of democracy. So I know we're at the end here. As I mentioned before, I want to discuss the role of God in Whitehead's cosmology. You discuss the possibility that we may need to reform Whitehead and even have a Whitehead without God. And you quote Nancy Frankenberry on this, emphasizing the contingency and the need to sort of distribute the capacity for novelty, rather than have it just be all sort of condensed in the primordial nature of God, and that maybe creativity and value and relevance can be understood to emerge from the web of relations constituting the universe and the history and the evolutionary history of that universe. And I wanted to, I guess, challenge that a bit and ask if, you say that we need to move away from this sort of fragmented identity politics towards a politics of common purpose. And you point to Whitehead's notion of beauty as a purpose or an aim that that we could all come to share in, that doesn't erase our differences. As you said, it allows them to come into harmonious contrast with one another in the realization of some deeper, more intense form of beauty. But I wonder if there's a sense in which, without some notion of a primordial source or an ideal lure, how it is that we can respond to the tragedies of history and still connect to the sense of possibility, the possibility of this beauty with a capital B, as it's an imminent lure, but in Whitehead's view, it needed to be in some way prefigured by, and is it a divine exception? Because we don't want our theology to be rooted in this exceptional being. And there are ways in which, even though Whitehead says he doesn't want to pay metaphysical compliments to God, he wants God to be just like every other creature. And God is a creature in Whitehead's view, and yet there are several instances where God's experience is different than finite actual occasions of experience. And so I appreciate the challenge to Whitehead's view, but I also wonder, if we step into this more Deweyan sense of God as a social function and the symbol of God as something we can use to orient our communities towards these ideals, does that negate the extent to which we are also made by God as the deeper value vectors trying to be realized in the course of cosmic history? So maybe we're not just creating God to serve a function for us, socially, but we're also in a way created by a naturalistic God, immanent in the cosmic process, that's trying to lure that process toward greater beauty. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, is it just that we're creating God, or is there also a way in which God, in the Whiteheadian sense, is creating us, and we're in a sort of call and response here?
That's a big question, as you know. It's a really big question.
So in 1 minute or less, go ahead.
Well, okay. So I think what I was trying to get at in the book around this was a couple of things. One, that I'm exploring the immanental tradition through Dewey, James, and Whitehead as an anti-exceptionalist tradition, right? And Whitehead specifically presents his concept of God as a concept that is allegedly consistent with the rest of the metaphysics and the cosmology as he's articulated it. And so part of what I wanted to do is point out that there are, I think, some reasons to challenge that, right? That there are some ways in which God as an actual entity is in conflict with or contradiction to other aspects of the cosmology in at least two respects, for sure. One, Whitehead's concept of God as an actual entity is non-perishing, whereas all other actual entities are temporal and have an event structure, and so concress and come to and end up entering into the what I call the cosmic compost bin of the process universe, right? They're recycled back into the universe. That's not the case for God. God is an actual entity in Whitehead's system that is non-perishing. And so there's one point of conflict. The other is not really so much the other contradiction, I guess, is that unlike other actual entities, God is internally related to all other actual entities, right? And that's not the case for other actual entities, which are internally related in proximate ways, temporally and spatially, to others, but not to all others. So there's two ways that I understand, and we might want to, there might be people that want to debate that, but those are the concerns that I see. So part of the issue is I think that there's some inconsistencies between the way Whitehead presents God within his system, and then there's some inconsistencies. But inconsistencies are one thing. I think that the religious and the ethical value of the concept of God, regardless of how it's constructed, is a different thing, different set of questions. And so part of what I was, part of the reasons Whitehead developed his God's concept was to provide an ontological setting for the emergence of novelty and also the conservation of value, right? So that value doesn't just dissolve, but has a resting place, value RIP, resting in the primordial aspect of God or in the consequent aspect of God. Mm-hmm. And so God serves a function to ontologically locate the emergence of novelty and also to have a resting place for value. So let's say that those are the religious as well as the metaphysical. What's the religious significance of those? Does value need to be conserved? Does it need to be permanent? Does it need to be non-perishing? To me, actually, I think that when we think about the phenomenology of what we value, our experience of what we value it because it's finite, because it's perishing, because it's precarious and vulnerable. That's the source of, I think, that our reasons for valuing something. So I don't think that the cosmic conservation of value is a necessary condition for things to have value. And in fact, I think the idea that the things that value perish are perpetually perishing is I think a more accurate phenomenology of value, of religious and moral. And then with respect to the emergence of novelty, Where does that come from? Is it from these from the primordial aspect of God, kind of interjecting itself into the world of actual entities in the Whiteheadian cosmology, or could it be that novelty is emergent out of complex networks and configurations of entities and occasions in relationship with one another? So why does novelty need to have an antecedent ontological location in the primordial aspect of God? Why can it not be just an emergent possibility? Right. So, and to me, both the perishing of value and the emergence of novelty are religiously significant and powerful ideas that I don't think that you need. So on the one hand, I think Whitehead's concept of God is in some ways in conflict with the logic of his cosmology. And on the other hand, I don't think that it's a religiously necessary idea. So now, to your question, do we need a concept of God, to Whiteheadian or otherwise, to mobilize us, to invigorate us, to lure us, or somehow towards the cosmic ideal of beauty? I mean, to me personally, I'll say I make use of the symbol of God in my personal spiritual life. I struggle continuously in my personal spiritual life not to hypostasize God, not to allow God to become, a being, right? And so I think that that's the reason why it's simultaneous, why it's appealing, because it gives us a kind of handle or a hook for our motivations, desires, purposes, and reasons for being in the world. But as soon as it's hypostasized and made into a supreme being, I think then it's just to me, it's religiously counterproductive and socially counterproductive to think that value needs to be, located antecedently in some other, being or realm, rather than thinking of it as emergent. So it gives me a kind of spiritual focus for prayer and for meditation. And yet it's also an internal struggle that I always personally have. So I just don't think that it's a I don't think it's that Whitehead's concept of God is religiously necessary. And I don't think it's socially or politically necessary, even though I can understand why existentially it's appealing. So that's my short answer to your very big question.
It is a big question, and I'm realizing maybe at some point in the future we can have another dialogue just on the intricacies of Whiteheadian process theology, because I think the problems, the inconsistencies you're pointing out are there. Plenty of Whitehead scholars have acknowledged this and tried to carry forward his vision, even where the technicalities of his system maybe failed to live up to that vision. So we can imagine God as a society of occasions rather than as an individual unperishing entity. We can emphasize the way in which the primordial nature of God as the first creature of creativity emerged contingently and wasn't somehow a metaphysical necessity. So I think there are ways of massaging Whitehead's texts to bring out these possibilities that you're pointing to, but we'll have to leave that for another conversation. Any final thoughts you want to share, Mike, before we wrap up?
No, but I sure appreciate the conversation, Matt. You've asked some really great questions, and I know you're really an expert on a lot of these things, and I appreciate very much your invitation to be a part of this. Thank you.
Yeah, likewise. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I'm actually working on a review of your book for process studies, which should be out, I think, the first quarter of next year. So it's really helpful to be able to talk through some of this with you as I write that. So
yeah, great.
Thanks for that as well.